Forget everything you think you remember about Twilight, because the version living in your memory, the one with the meadow, the sparkling skin, and so the lion fell in love with the lamb, that is not actually the movie that was shot. Go back and watch the first 15 minutes with the sound of nostalgia turned off. Look at the color. Everything is drained. Blue-gray. Overcast, like the film itself has a fever. Look at how Edward Cullen is introduced, not with a swell of romantic music, but with a hard cut, a gust of wind that shouldn't exist indoors, and Bella's own internal voice narrating something closer to a warning than a crush. Look at the blocking. Edward doesn't walk toward Bella like a love interest. He's shot like a predator clocking movement in tall grass, still, watching, calculating, right up until the moment he isn't. And when he finally does move fast, the camera can't even keep up with him. That's not a meet-cute. That's a horror movie's monster reveal, slowed down just enough that you mistake the dread for butterflies. Here's what nobody talks about. Twilight was never a romance that happened to feature a vampire. It is a horror film, shot with horror film grammar, populated with horror film staging, that got sold to the world as a love story so successfully that an entire generation forgot what they were actually looking at. And the deeper you go, the stranger this gets. Because it isn't just the first movie. Every single director who touched this saga after Catherine Hardwicke was chosen, deliberately, because of what they understood about fear, and each new film in the franchise escalates the horror logic in lockstep with exactly how close Bella Swan is getting to becoming the monster herself. This isn't a coincidence of scheduling. This is design. Listen to the score underneath that cafeteria scene again, too. Composer Carter Burwell doesn't give you strings that swell toward romance. He gives you a held, dissonant note that sits under the scene like something waiting to resolve and never quite does. That's not a love theme. That's tension scoring, the exact musical grammar a thriller uses when a character is being watched by something they haven't clocked yet. And that's just the beginning. Welcome to CineLogic, where we break down movies not by what happened, but by why it was built that way. Today we're going underneath Twilight, not the Team Edward versus Team Jacob debate, not the sparkle memes, not the 20th hidden Easter egg listicle. We're breaking down the actual visual and structural architecture of the saga, the color grade, the director rotation, the genre grammar hiding underneath the marketing, and the one thesis that reframes what this franchise was actually doing the entire time. If this is your first time at CineLogic, this channel is about understanding cinema, not just watching it. Hit subscribe. Let's get into it. Here's what the internet already has covered, extensively, for almost 2 decades. Twilight is a 2018 romance about Bella Swan, a quiet, clumsy teenager who moves to the perpetually rainy town of Forks, Washington, and falls in love with Edward Cullen, a beautiful, broody, eternally 17-year-old vampire who has to fight the urge to kill her every time he's near her. It's an abstinence metaphor. Everyone knows that. Stephanie Meyer, a Mormon author, wrote a story where the central danger of intimacy is literalized as a boy who could kill you the moment you get too close, and the entire saga is about the tension of wanting something you're told to resist. Everyone knows the apple on the book cover means forbidden fruit. Everyone knows the mirrors and the reflections and the diamond-like skin are shorthand for immortality and vanity. Everyone knows Bella's truck is slow and clunky because she's human and flawed, while Edward's Volvo is fast and silver because he's superhuman and controlled. Everyone's noticed that every Cullen and every human orbiting Bella drives a car that maps onto their personality: Emmett's rough and tumble Jeep, Rosalie's sleek convertible, Mike Newton's suburban dad SUV signaling comfortable middle-class ordinariness. This is the surface layer symbolism that's been written up in 1,000 blog posts and study guides, and none of it is wrong. It's just incomplete. Everyone knows Bella herself is built as a stand-in for the reader, deliberately underwritten, a near-blank narrator so that the audience can pour themselves into her point of view. Everyone knows Stephanie Meyer wrote the saga from a place of specific religious and cultural conservatism, and that the entire wait, resist, Don't cross the line until marriage. Architecture of the story maps cleanly onto that background. Everyone knows the Team Edward horror film uses to let a character process that the thing in front of them is not what they believed it was. The reveal of the monster's true nature is a scene-type horror has used for a century, the werewolf's first transformation, the creature stepping out of shadow into light. Twilight borrows that exact rhythm and simply refuses to let the music tell you to be afraid. Then there's the truck. Early in the film, a van skids across an icy parking lot toward Bella, and Edward closes the distance in a blur, stopping it with his bare hand inches from her body. Watch how it's shot. The sound design drops out right before impact. The frame goes into a controlled slow motion, and the van screech is mixed louder than anything else in the scene. That is a jump scare's technical construction, the near-miss beat horror movies use to make an audience's chest tighten, deployed here to introduce Edward's power instead of a slasher's blade. The tools are identical. Only the credited genre is different. And that structure didn't happen by accident. So who actually made this call, and what was the alternative? Catherine Hardwicke has spoken about fighting to keep Twilight grounded, to resist the pull toward a glossier, more conventionally romantic teen movie that a nervous studio might have wanted instead. Summit Entertainment, the studio behind the film, was not a major player at the time. This was an independent studio betting an enormous portion of its resources on a YA adaptation that, on paper, looked like a niche book series with a passionate but unproven fan base. There was no guarantee this worked. Every dollar spent, every tonal choice made, carried real risk. That risk pushed the production toward economy, and Hardwicke, whether by necessity or instinct, turned that economy into atmosphere. Instead of manufacturing a stylized romantic look with elaborate lighting rigs and warm-toned soundstage sets, the production leaned into what Forks, Washington actually offered for free: fog, overcast skies, damp forest, natural gray light. That's a budget decision. But Hardwicke and Davis didn't just accept it, they weaponized it, pushing the grade even further into cold blue territory than the natural light alone would have produced, because it made the entire town feel like it was holding its breath. Here's the detail almost nobody brings up. The film's climax was originally going to be bigger, louder, and more conventionally action movie. Early drafts of the script reportedly built toward a more elaborate, more explosive confrontation at the prom involving Victoria, expanding the danger into a larger set-piece battle. That version got scrapped. The filmmakers pulled back from the bigger, flashier climax and stayed close to the book's smaller, adds the bigger fight. Hardwicke's team went the other way, towards something more intimate, more cruel, more specifically frightening. James doesn't want to just kill Bella. He wants to make her fear last. He wants footage. That's not blockbuster spectacle. That's a stalker horror sequence, structured exactly like the third act of a slasher film, and the filmmakers chose it on purpose over the version with more explosions. That's the through line. At every single decision point where the production could have leaned toward glossy teen romance, it leaned toward dread instead. The color grade. The blocking. The choice to keep James's attack small, personal, and camcorder cruel instead of expanding it into a set piece. None of this reads as accidental once you line it up. This is a horror filmmaker's instincts, operating inside a marketing plan that was busy selling the film as something else entirely. It's worth sitting with just how cornered that ballet studio sequence actually is. James doesn't ambush Bella in the open, he lures her there with a faked hostage tape of her own mother, meaning the entire final confrontation is built on a horror staple, the monster manipulating the victim into walking into the trap herself. Then he breaks her leg on camera, on purpose, because he wants Edward to arrive to a recording of the kill. That's not a teen movie villain. That's a predator with a taste for documentation, a detail horror cinema has used for decades to signal a killer who treats violence as performance. A studio chasing glossy romance cuts that beat, or softens it. Hardwicke's team kept it, framed tight, lit harshly, cut fast, pained, three-actor climax in an empty room instead of a sprawling action set piece with stunt work and effects. Hardwick turned a budget constraint into a directorial signature, and the byproduct of that thrift is a film that reads as unmistakably more frightening than its financing would ever suggest it should. And once Hardwick stepped away from the franchise after the first film, something even stranger happened. The tone didn't reset. It escalated. Deliberately. Film by film. Here's the layer that connects everything, and it's hiding in plain sight in the credits. Twilight had 4 different directors across 5 films, and the conventional explanation for that has always been scheduling. Hardwick was reportedly not asked back partly over budget and timeline friction, and each subsequent director came aboard under tight, franchise-driven production windows. That's the official story, and it's probably true as far as it goes. But look at who Summit actually chose for each installment, and the pattern stops looking like a series of unrelated hires. It starts looking like a specific escalation, matched almost exactly to where Bella is in her transformation from human prey into vampire predator. New Moon went to Chris Weitz, a director whose range is actually the point. He'd co-directed broad teen comedy early in his career, then pivoted toward literary, melancholic material, adapting The Golden Compass and co-directing the wistful coming-of-age film about a boy. That combination, someone fluent in both teenage interiority and adult, literary sadness, is exactly the register New Moon needed, because the film has to sell both a heartbroken teenager's melodrama and something closer to genuine clinical depression, back to back, in the same character. New Moon is the installment where Edward leaves, where Bella spirals into a months-long depression rendered on screen as an actual visual device, the camera circling her in her bedroom as seasons blur past in seconds. It's not a horror film in the traditional sense. It's a grief film. And Weitz, a director attuned to loss and literary melancholy, was the correct choice for exactly that register. But it's also the film where the werewolves are introduced, and where the horror grammar shifts from vampire as predator to body as something that violently transforms without consent, which is exactly the werewolf mythology's core horror. Then Eclipse went to David Slade. And this is the hire that should stop you in your tracks the moment you know his prior credits, because there are 2 of them, and both point in the same direction. Slade directed 30 Days of Night, a brutal, unapologetically violent vampire horror film about a town in Alaska besieged by vampires during a month of endless darkness. Summit did not hire a romance director for Eclipse. They hired a filmmaker who had just made one of the most viscerally frightening vampire movies of the previous decade. But Slade's other major credit before Eclipse is arguably even more relevant, and almost nobody connects it to Twilight at all: Hard Candy. A psychological thriller built entirely around a predator and prey relationship between an adult man and a teenage girl, and around the question of who actually holds the power in that dynamic once the roles start to invert. That is, structurally, the exact question Eclipse is asking about Bella. By this point in the saga, she's no longer a passive final girl reacting to danger. She's actively choosing the monster, negotiating the terms of her own transformation, weighing Edward against Jacob with an agency the earlier films didn't give her. Slade is a director whose entire body of work, before this franchise, is fixated on the moment prey stops behaving like prey. Hiring him for the installment where Bella starts making that exact pivot isn't a coincidence anyone should wave away. And Eclipse is, not coincidentally, the most violent installment in the Twilight saga up to that point. Victoria's army of newborn vampires, decapitations, a full-scale vampire war staged in the forest outside Forks. The tonal shift isn't incidental. It's the exact moment the story turns from courtship into war, and Summit brought in someone who had already proven, twice over, that he understood. Blood, screaming, followed immediately by Edward biting into her chest and injecting venom directly into her heart to save her life, transforming her at the literal moment of death. Strip away every ounce of the saga's romantic branding and describe that sequence cold, shot by shot, to someone who's never seen it. A woman's body is destroyed from the inside by something growing in her that isn't fully human, and she survives only by being turned into a monster. That is not a wedding arc epilogue. That is a body horror climax, and Condon was hired specifically because his filmography proves he wouldn't soften it. Line these 4 choices up and the pattern is impossible to miss. Dread specialist for the introduction of the monster. Melancholy specialist for the grief of losing him. Horror specialist for the war that follows. Body horror and decay specialist for the transformation itself. Each director was, whether by explicit intent or extraordinary instinct on Summit's part, matched to the exact register of fear the story needed at that specific stage of Bella's arc. This isn't a franchise that drifted in tone because of turnover. This is a franchise whose tonal identity was built, chapter by chapter, by choosing filmmakers who each specialized in a different flavor of fear, timed precisely to Bella's proximity to becoming the thing she started the story fleeing from. Here's where the studio math comes into focus, and it explains why Twilight couldn't ever be marketed as the horror film it actually was, even though it was shot like one. Summit Entertainment, before Twilight, was not a household name. It was a young, independent studio without the used what Fork's actual climate gave them for free, and then, as we covered, pushed the grade even colder than necessary in post. That's a horror film's budget logic hiding inside what the trailers sold as a warm, aspirational teen romance. The rushed follow-up productions compound this. New Moon moved into production on a tight turnaround specifically because fan demand and studio urgency wanted the sequel out as fast as possible, capitalizing on the first film's unexpected success. That urgency is exactly why a new director was needed each time schedules didn't align with returning talent, but instead of treating that turnover as a liability, Summit's choices, whether by savvy or luck, turned every replacement into a tonal upgrade specific to that film's content. The soundtrack strategy reinforces the same disguise. Summit didn't score these films purely with orchestral cues, it built each soundtrack around credible, mainstream indie and alternative rock acts, Muse, Paramore, Radiohead-adjacent moody guitar bands, artists with real critical currency outside the franchise. That's a marketing move aimed squarely at making Twilight feel like a cool, cred-worthy romance rather than a genre picture, the same way a horror film's trailer will sometimes license a warm pop song specifically to make the footage look friendlier than the film actually is. Pair that soundtrack strategy with mall retail tie-ins, magazine cover cycles, and a press campaign built entirely around Robert Pattinson and Kristen Stewart's real-life chemistry, and you get a promotional apparatus with zero interest in the color grade underneath it. The romance was the product being sold. The horror was simply what got filmed, because the director understood the material better than the marketing department needed her to. Even the film's press cycle reinforced the split. Convention panels and early press access leaned on the cast's chemistry and the epic love story pitch, framing every question toward romance, fandom, and heartthrob appeal rather than toward Hardwick's visual choices. Reviewers who did clock the film's tonal strangeness at the time tended to read it as a flaw, uneven, can't decide what it wants to be, rather than as a director successfully running 2 genres in the same frame without the marketing department's permission. That critical blind spot is itself evidence of how well the disguise worked. Even professional critics, watching closely, filed the horror grammar as a mistake instead of a method. The result is a franchise that was commercially engineered to read as romance to the audience buying tickets, while creatively built, from the color grade up, as horror for anyone actually paying attention to the craft. That gap between what the marketing sold and what the camera was doing is exactly why the film has aged the way it has. Audiences bought a love story. What they actually absorbed, frame by frame, was dread dressed up in a prom dress. And that gap is exactly what a new generation is now rediscovering, on purpose, for laughs. Here's the insight that her to get away. Twilight builds Bella Swan using every visual and narrative convention of a final girl, and then breaks the convention on purpose, at the most fundamental level a horror story can break it. Bella isn't running from the monster to survive. She is running toward becoming the monster, as fast as the story will let her. Look at how Edward describes himself to her, almost word for word, in the meadow scene. arguably the film's most quoted moment, and almost universally remembered as swoon-worthy romantic dialogue. He tells her, plainly, that he's the world's most dangerous predator. That everything about him, his voice, his face, even his smell, is designed by evolution to lure prey in. He tells her he's killed people before. He tells her she is, in his own words, exactly my brand of heroine. Strip the swelling music and the golden hour lighting out of that scene and read the dialogue cold. That is a predator monologuing to a victim about exactly how he's built to destroy her, and exactly why she should be terrified. A traditional horror final girl hears that monologue and runs. Bella hears it and leans in closer. That inversion is the actual engine of the entire saga, and it's why the abstinence metaphor, reading while true, is incomplete. The deeper structure isn't just, desire is dangerous, so wait. It's, the horror genre says the correct response to the monster is survival, and this story argues that Bella's correct response is surrender. Every subsequent film escalates that argument. In New Moon, her grief over Edward's absence isn't played as a healthy character learning to move on as the only real escape from mortality's horror. And in Breaking Dawn, the final girl doesn't defeat the monster or escape the monster. She becomes it. On purpose. Through a pregnancy the story frames as nearly killing her, followed by a transformation she requests, at the point of death, with full knowledge of what she's choosing. This is the detail that critics dismissed for years as bad writing, an author's wish-fulfillment fantasy without the genre self-awareness to see what it was actually depicting. But look at it as a structural inversion instead of a failure, and it becomes something much stranger and more interesting. A horror film where the audience is trained, scene by scene, color grade by color grade, director hire by director hire, to root for the final girl's transformation into the exact thing the genre usually demands she destroy. Look at New Moon through the same lens and the inversion gets even more explicit. When Edward leaves, the film doesn't just show Bella sad, it shows her screaming in the woods, then cuts across months in a single unbroken shot of her sitting motionless in a chair by her window as the seasons change outside the glass. That's not a heartbreak montage. That's a horror film's visual language for a body that stopped functioning, held on for an uncomfortably long time, well past the point a normal romantic drama would cut away. Then Bella starts deliberately putting herself in physical danger, cliff diving, riding motorcycles she can't control, seeking out cheap adrenaline, specifically because doing so lets her hallucinate Edward's voice warning her to stop. She is manufacturing near-death experiences to hear the monster again. A horror final girl avoids danger to survive. Bella manufactures danger to feel close to the thing that endangers her. That is the inversion stated as plainly as the film ever states anything. And when Jacob's arc folds in, the story doesn't offer him as a safe alternative to the horror, it reveals that he comes with his own transformation horror built in. The werewolf mythology gives Bella a second monster to love, one whose body horror is framed through violent, involuntary, rage-triggered shape-shifting instead of bloodlust. Bella isn't choosing between a monster and a safe human option in New Moon and Eclipse. She's choosing between two different flavors of monster. The safe option in this horror story is the one built out of ordinary human decay, and everyone in the narrative, Bella most of all, treats it as the worst fate available. Once you see that Bella's arc isn't a romance overcoming a horror element, but a horror story about wanting to lose to the monster, you can't watch the meadow scene the same way again. This is exactly why the 2026 Twilight Renaissance isn't a random nostalgia cycle, it's a generation finally watching the film the way it was actually shot. Gen Z grew up on an entirely different horror diet than the audience Twilight was originally marketed to. Elevated horror, slow-burn dread, grief-coded monsters, films that use atmosphere and color grading as the primary scare mechanism rather than jump scares, became mainstream taste over the last decade. Audiences trained on that kind of horror grammar are, whether consciously or not, exactly the audience equipped to notice what Catherine Hardwicke actually built back in 2008. A film using restraint, cold color, and predator blocking to generate dread, wrapped around a love story. That's why the memes work the way they do. When Gen Z creators clip Edward's black eyes, or Bella's flat effect, or the baseball scene's sudden tonal drop into pack-territorial menace, they're not mocking bad filmmaking. They're pointing a camera, so to speak, at something that was always there, dread, coded into the frame, and laughing at the fact that a whole generation absorbed it as romance the first time around. The comedy is real. But it's comedy built on recognition, not mockery of incompetence. That's an important distinction, and it's why the resurgence has staying power instead of being a one-week internet joke. It also explains the timing of Twilight's exclusive move to a major streaming platform in 2026, landing the saga in front of an audience raised on horror-literate viewing habits, at the exact moment nostalgia cycles for mid-2000s culture were already accelerating. The franchise didn't get lucky. It got rediscovered by an audience that finally had the genre vocabulary to see what was on screen the whole time. Look at what the resurgence has actually produced, beyond just streaming numbers. Beauty brands have relaunched cosmetics palettes branded explicitly around the film's cold, pale, otherworldly look, the same blue-gray desaturation we spent this entire breakdown tracing back to a horror director's instinct. Fragrance companies have built entire product lines around the smell of forks, selling the atmosphere of an overcast, dread-soaked forest as an aspirational scent. None of that packaging sells warmth. It sells the chill. Which means the merchandising economy built around this romance, in 2026, is explicitly monetizing the horror atmosphere Hardwick fought a nervous studio to keep in the first place. The disguise has come full circle. The thing being sold as nostalgia is, materially, the horror craft itself. That's also why this resurgence doesn't behave like a typical nostalgia wave. Most 2000s nostalgia cycles run on affection for things audiences already understood correctly the first time, a beloved sitcom, a comfort watch action franchise. Twilight's cycle runs on reinterpretation. The joke and the appreciation are the same reaction, arriving at once, because the audience is discovering a film that was always more sophisticated in its construction than the discourse around it ever admitted. And there's a franchise-forward angle worth watching closely here too. Stephenie Meyer's companion novel told from Edward's perspective reframes the entire first book's events explicitly through the eyes of the predator restraining himself around prey, internal monologue that reads, structurally, even closer to horror interiority than Bella's original narration ever did. Any future adaptation drawing from that material would have almost no choice but to lean into the horror register more overtly, because Edward's own perspective, on the page, is largely about the discipline required not to kill the girl he loves. If Summit or its successors ever greenlight that adaptation, it will not be able to hide behind soft lighting and a marketing campaign built on sunlight and prom dresses. The genre will be sitting right there on the surface, because it's coming from inside the monster's head, and an audience that has already learned, through a decade of memes and rewatches, to read Edward's restraint as barely contained violence rather than as devotion, will have no patience left for a marketing team pretending otherwise. The horror was always the foundation. The romance was always the disguise. And the franchise's second life is happening precisely because a new audience finally noticed which one was load-bearing. Here's the central argument. The one everything in this breakdown has been building toward. Twilight is not a romance with horror elements. It is traced points back to that same design. The blue-gray desaturation that makes forks feel like a fever dream instead of a postcard. The predator and prey blocking in the cafeteria and the biology classroom. The scrapped, bigger, more conventional action climax in favor of a smaller, crueler, more intimate stalker sequence. The director rotation that reads, in hindsight, less like scheduling turnover and more like a deliberate escalation from dread to grief to war to body horror. The studio's calculated marketing gap between what the trailers sold and what the camera was actually doing. And underneath all of it, the meadow scene's predator monologue, dialogue that a horror film would use to make you fear for its heroine, repurposed here to make you want her to stay. And that's why the so bad it's good framing was always the laziest possible reading. A film that's genuinely bad at what it's trying to do doesn't accidentally produce a coherent, sustained, four-sequel escalation of horror-adjacent directorial hires matched precisely to its heroine's psychological state. Incompetence doesn't organize itself that cleanly across 5 films and 8 years of production. Somewhere between Catherine Hardwicke's fight to keep the grade cold, Summit's choice to bring in a 30 Days of Night director for the war chapter, and Bill Condon's unflinching handling of a body horror birth scene, there was a consistent creative instinct operating underneath the marketing, whether any single person at Summit could have articulated it in these terms or not. That's the reason this franchise refuses to die, refuses to stay a punchline, refuses to be just nostalgia. It was never simply, so bad it's good. It was to finally see the shape underneath the costume. Think about how rare that actually is. Most films get misread once, by one era, and then either get corrected on rewatch or stay misunderstood forever. Twilight got read correctly by almost nobody, for almost 2 decades, while every technical choice that would have told a horror-literate viewer the truth sat directly on screen the entire time, in the grade, in the blocking, in who Summit hired behind the camera each time the story needed a new register of fear. That's not a film that got lucky with a savvy marketing team. That's a film whose true genre was hidden in plain sight so effectively that it took a generational shift in visual literacy to be seen at all. Once you notice that shape, the whole saga plays differently. The swoon and the scare were never actually opposites in this story. They were always the same shot. And the fact that it took the internet almost 20 years, a streaming platform migration, and an entire generation with a different relationship to fear on screen to finally say so out loud, that's not a joke at Twilight's expense. That's a testament to how well the film's actual direction did its job, right under everyone's nose, the whole time. That's the logic behind Twilight. And here's the thing, this isn't the last time this saga is getting the CineLogic treatment. There's an entire second layer we haven't even touched yet, the way Jacob and the wolf pack function as a completely different horror tradition, body transformation horror, inherited from werewolf mythology going back a century, sitting right next to vampire horror in the same story, and almost nobody's mapped how those two traditions are in direct competition for Bella's arc. That's coming. If this made you see Twilight differently, if you walked in remembering a prom dress romance and you're walking out realizing you just described a horror film's blocking chart, subscribe to CineLogic. Because this is what we do. For every franchise. Even the ones everyone assumes have already been fully explained, already been memed into a punchline, already been figured out by 20 years of pop culture consensus. That consensus is usually the surface. The actual architecture is almost always one layer further down than the discourse ever bothered to go. We don't react. We understand. And one question before you go, I want your actual take on this. Do you think Catherine Hardwicke and Summit Entertainment knew exactly what they were building, a horror film disguised as a romance? Or do you think the horror grammar slipped in by instinct, because Hardwicke simply couldn't direct fear any other way? Was this a calculated disguise, or an accident of who was behind the camera? Drop your answer below. I'm reading every comment. The next breakdown is coming soon. And it goes even deeper.